Good evening and welcome to Skyline's Immigration Desk. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Driti Atri, and tonight we are talking about something that connects technology, jobs, artificial intelligence, and immigration. Because for millions of Indians who are working, studying, or planning to move abroad, these are not just separate stories anymore. 13 stories, one big question. Is the global dream of working, studying, and settling abroad becoming harder than ever before? So let's start with the first one tonight. For years, there was a simple belief in the tech industry. If you reach the top, you were safer. If you become a senior manager, senior engineer, a principal architect, a director, or a vice president, well, surely your job had some protection. But that assumption that is being challenged now, Visa, one of the biggest names in global payment, it has announced plans for major workforce reduction according to the reports that were given to TimesXP. And you know what makes this particular story striking is where the cuts are reportedly landing. Not just at the bottom of corporate ladder though, not just among the junior employees. Senior technology and product roles, they are also reportedly being affected. That's right, at Visa's Foster City headquarters, the supplied data points to hundreds of employees being let go, including senior leadership and engineering positions. Can you think about what that really means? A person may have spent 10, 15, or maybe 20 years building a career in technology. Well, they may have climbed the corporate ladder themselves. They may have reached maybe a salary that most of the people they can only dream about. And yet, when a company decides that its future needs a different kind of structure, that superiority, that seniority, it may suddenly offer very little protection. This is the new reality of corporate technology. Be it India, be it US, companies are not simply asking who is performing well. They are also asking a much bigger question. Do we still need this entire layer of organization or not? And this is where AI enters the entire picture. Because the next phase of technology revolution, it may not simply be about replacing repetitive work. It may be about redesigning the entire team. Because if companies are cutting highly paid technology professionals, the obvious question is, where is that money actually going? Artificial intelligence was initially sold to workers as a tool, something that would make their jobs easier. Well, write the first draft. In fact, check the code, analyze the entire data, find the error, but the corporate world is now asking a very difficult question and a different one. What if AI does not just assess the employee? What if it changes how many employees the company needs? Well, that is the heart of the so-called AI efficiency story. Financial companies are investing heavily in artificial intelligence. They are investing in automation, fraud detection software, software development tool, and increasingly autonomous AI system. And that creates a very uncomfortable equation here. If one AI-powered system can perform work that previously required several other people, well, a company may decide it can operate with a smaller team. One engineer supervises the system, one architect designs the larger framework, automated tools test the software, AI monitors system, and the traditional layers in between begin to look expensive here. And this is why the current technology reconstructing is different from an ordinary recession. In a normal downturn, well, companies cut jobs because business loses. Then, when business improves, they hire again. But if a company cuts a job because technology has changed the way the work is performed, the job may not return in exactly same form. And yes, that is the real concern here. The question is no longer simply, when will hiring come back? Well, the question is, will the same jobs come back at all? And for foreign workers, specifically the H-1B professionals, that question is even more serious because losing a job does not only mean losing a salary. It can also mean losing immigration security as well. And that brings us to the ticking clock that thousands of H-1B workers know all too well. Now, for an American worker, a layoff is devastating. But there is at least one thing that they usually still have: time. For an H-1B worker, time can become the most expensive thing in the room. Under the current rule described in our report, eligible H-1B workers can generally have a grace period of up to 60 days after employment ends or until their I-94 validity expires, whichever comes first. 60 days. That sounds like 2 months. But think about what has to happen inside those 2 months. You have to find a job. The employer has to be willing to sponsor you. The company has to evaluate your profile. The legal team has to prepare the immigration paperwork. The required filing have to be made correctly. And you may have a family depending on your status. A spouse, children, a mortgage, a house, school fee, health insurance, and perhaps years of life invested in America. Suddenly, your career becomes a countdown, and this is where the immigration system and the tech job markets collide. Because the H-1B system was designed around employment. But employment is precisely what can disappear overnight. There is another complication here. Many professionals have spent years waiting for permanent residency. Their employer may have started the green card process. Well, they may have invested years into perm and I-140 procedures. Then one layoff happens and suddenly the entire strategy, it has to be reassessed. Well, that is why an H-1B layoff, that is not just a workplace story, it is a family story. And sometimes it becomes a decision about whether an entire family stays in America or starts over somewhere else. And the problem becomes even bigger when the same layoffs are happening across the entire tech industry. Visa is not operating in isolation. Across technology and financial services, companies have been reconstructing teams, reducing cost, reconsidering how many employees they need. Well, the names are familiar, by the way: Meta, Amazon, Oracle, LinkedIn, Cisco, MasterCard, Block, and many others. Here, the important point is not simply the number of jobs that are disappearing. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a pattern. Companies are becoming more cautious about large organizational structure. They want smaller teams, they want higher productivity, they want automation, and they want every single dollar of corporate spending to produce measurable value. This changes the job market entirely, because when one major company cuts thousands of roles, well, those workers do not disappear. They enter the same job market as everybody else. So suddenly, one senior engineer is competing against another senior engineer. One product manager is competing against thousands of product managers further. And guess what? The companies that are still hiring, they can become extremely selective. In the meantime, for the H-1B professional, the whole situation, it can be even more difficult, because not every employer is willing or able to sponsor immigration. So imagine being an experienced engineer with an impressive resume. You find 10 suitable jobs for you. Then you discover only 4 are open to sponsorship. Then perhaps 2 are eventually willing to move forward. And now the clock is running. This is why the technology slowdown can hit professionals differently. The same economic shock can produce a very different personal consequences for everyone. And yes, while this is happening in America, another trend is becoming impossible to ignore. The jobs, they are not simply disappearing. In fact, some of the work is now moving. And one of the biggest destinations is India, which is a very proud moment for every single Indian. There was once a very predictable career ladder in Silicon Valley. You started as a junior developer, then you became a middle-level engineer, then a senior engineer, and then perhaps an engineering manager, then a director. Now, that middle section of ladder, that creates millions of tech career. But now, companies are experiencing with something very, very different. Fewer layers, smaller teams, more automation. That means some of the roles sitting between junior execution and senior strategic leadership, they are under immense pressure. In the meantime, technical program managers, generalist engineers, some management level, some testing functions, some coordination heavy roles. Why? Because companies are discovering that software can increasingly automate parts of coordination, testing, documentation, and development. AI tools can generate code, automated systems can run the tests, platforms can monitor infrastructure, data pipeline can flag anomalies. So, a company may decide that instead of having a larger team responsible for every single stage, it can have a smaller team supervising a much more automated system. And guess what? That changes the entire career ladder. The biggest danger is not necessarily that every middle level engineering role is disappearing now. It is that the number of available seats at that level that becomes smaller. And yes, that can make career progression more harder now. For Indian professionals in the US, there is another layer to this. If the middle layer that is shrinking in America, some of the work can be performed from global capability centers in India. In fact, places like Bengaluru, places like Hyderabad, Chennai, Pune, Gurugram, India is no longer simply the outsourcing destination of the past. Wake up! It is increasingly becoming a location of engineering, analytics, cybersecurity, cloud infrastructure, AI development. So the geography of technology world, that is definitely changing. Yes, this is where the American layoff story meets an Indian opportunity story. For years, the dream was simple. Move from India to America, build a career, earn in dollars, buy a home, get permanent residency, stay permanently. But today, there is another possibility emerging now. Build the next phase of that career here in India itself. Global Capabilities Centers or GCCs. They are expanding rapidly across Indian technology hubs. These centers are no longer just back offices, let me tell you that. They can house software engineering, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, cloud infrastructure, risk management, research, product development, and increasingly senior technology leadership. For a professional returning from the United States, this kind of creates an interesting paradox here. Well, they may be leaving America, but they may not be leaving the global technology ecosystem. A person who spent about 15 years working for the American company may now take that experience back to India to join a GCC managing team that continue to work on global product. This is not simply a story about people being forced to return. No, it is also a story about India becoming more capable of absorbing the global talent. But there is a financial reality. Let me give you that reality check here. A salary earned in dollars cannot simply be compared with a salary earned in rupees. Housing costs are different, taxes are different, education costs are different, lifestyle expectations are different. So returning to India can be an opportunity, but it also requires financial planning. And for some workers, the question is not whether they return. It is whether they can choose where they return. Because there are now other options too, and wait, Canada is one of them. For professionals exhausted by the American immigration maze, Canada is representing itself as the alternative. But even that door, it comes with a condition. For years, Canada was seen as the friendly alternative. If America had H-1B lottery, Canada had points. If America had long green card queue, Canada had express entry. If America offered uncertainty, Canada appeared to offer predictability. And that is why Canadian immigration has attracted so much attention from Indian technology professionals now. There are several paths, by the way. There are employment-backed work permit. There are a global talent stream. There are intra-company transfer option. And there is express entry for permanent residence. For somebody already working for a multinational company in America, an internal transfer to a Canadian office, it can sometimes become an important option. But let's be clear here, ladies and gentlemen, Canada is not a magic escape button. Canadian immigration policy is also changing now. The country is managing housing pressure. It is reviewing temporary resident level. It is tightening some of immigration pathway. And yes, salaries in major Canadian technology hubs may not match Silicon Valley compensation. So moving north, it can solve one problem while creating another one. Taxes can be higher, housing is expensive, and the cost of living in cities such as Toronto or Vancouver, it can be significant. There is also the cross-border tax question, by the way. If you have a 401k investments, property or other financial interest in America, moving countries does not automatically erase your tax responsibility. So Canada may offer a new route, but it requires planning. And there is an interesting long-term possibility here. You know why? Because for some professionals, Canada is not just an alternative to America. It can become a bridge back into the American market. Here's where the story gets interesting. Suppose a technology professional moves from the United States to Canada. They build their career over there. They eventually obtained Canadian permanent residence. Perhaps years later, they become the Canadian citizen. The question is, could that reopen access to the US? Let me answer that for you. Potentially, in some professions, Canadian citizens may qualify for USMCA, formerly NAFTA, professional work status, commonly known as TN status, if they meet the specific requirement. But there is a crucial distinction here. Canadian permanent residents, they are not the same as Canadian residents for TN purposes. So this is not an overnight cutout. It is a long-term strategy. The idea is simple here. Canada can provide a more predictable permanent residence pathway for many people. And then after meeting the relevant requirement, Canadian citizenship can potentially provide additional professional mobility here. Well, for a technology worker, this could create a two-country career. Live in Canada, work for a global company, maintain connections to the American market, and potentially move between the two under the appropriate legal framework. But you know what? Immigration is never just about a visa. It can also be about taxes, employment contracts, family status, and long-term planning. And yes, while some workers are looking for a way into Canada, others are simply trying to protect the status they already have. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to another major development tonight. You know why? Because before choosing another country, H-1B workers need to ask a very simple and a very basic question. Is their current employer actually complaint or not? For an H-1B worker, the employer is not just the person signing your salary check. The employer is connected to your immigration status, which means one simple question becomes extremely important. Well, who exactly is sponsoring you? According to the reports supplied to TimesXP, well, several companies appearing on the US Department of Labor's willful violators or rebarment record too. This is very important because federal agencies can take actions against employers that seriously violate the H-1B labor rule. These violations, it can include wage issue, improper employment practices, or false statement connected to the immigration filing. Now, one term you may hear is benching. Simple words, they can refer to an employer failing to pay an H-1B worker properly during period when the worker is not assigned productive work, well, where the law requires payment. For the worker, this is not a technical paperwork issue. No, it can become a serious immigration problem for that worker because if your employer is under investigation, sanctioned, or debarred, you may suddenly find yourself caught in a situation that you did not create, not your fault. And this is why immigration experts repeatedly emphasize documentation. Keep your pay records, keep your employment documents, know what your labor condition application says. Know what your employer has actually promised you. And before joining an unfamiliar consultancy or staffing company, understand who the real employer is. Because in the H-1B system, your employer's compliance, it can become part of your immigration story. And for Indians waiting for something much bigger, the green card. The next story is perhaps the most frustrating of all of them. Well, for an Indian professional, getting an American job can be difficult, but getting a green card can be entirely different battle. You may have a good job, you may pay taxes, you may own a house, your children may grow up in America, you may spend 15 or maybe 20 years building your life over there. And yet, your permanent residency may still be stuck in a queue. Well, here the reason is the structure of the employment-based immigration system. There are annual numerical limit here. There are per country limit, and India has a huge pool of applicants competing for a limited number of employment-based immigrant visas further. This has created extraordinarily long wait in categories such as EB2 and EB3, and that creates an uncomfortable situation for Indians. You can be highly skilled, highly paid, highly educated, and still not have permanent immigration security. Your temporary visa may have been extended again and then again. Your children can face age out concern. Your family decisions can become tied to immigration timeline. And that is why professionals explore alternative now. EB1 where eligible, EB5 for those who meet its requirements, other employment categories, or increasingly moving to another country. But there is an important problem here. Even filing the paperwork correctly is becoming more difficult and important now. And that brings us to USCIS. Because in immigration, sometimes the biggest threat, that is not a major policy change. It is one small mistake on a form. Immigration paperwork is unforgiving. A missing signature, an outdated form, a missing supporting document, an incorrect fee, a document that requires translation but is submitted without one. These may sound like small mistakes to you, but let's be honest here. Immigration applications are not like ordinary office paperwork. They are legal filing. Every page matters, every date matters, every supporting document matters. And there is another important point here. Not every USCIS case automatically receives an opportunity to fix every deficiency. The exact treatment depends on the type of filing, the nature of the deficiency, and applicable USCIS rule and policy. So, if you are filing an H-1B petition, an I-485 and an I-765 or another immigration application, do not assume that USCIS will just send me an RFE if something is missing there. Ladies and gentlemen, that assumption can be dangerous. The safer approach, very simple. Read the latest form instruction, check the edition date, check the fee, check the signature, check the supporting evidence. And if the case is complicated, speak with a qualified immigration counsel. Because let's be honest here, when your immigration status depends on a document almost correct, that is not the same as correct. And yes, while workers are fighting to stay in America, families planning to study abroad are discovering that getting into these countries, it is becoming extremely harder. For years, the formula was very familiar, as I keep on repeating. Study abroad, get a degree, find a job, get a work permit, and perhaps eventually become a permanent resident. Now, for thousands of Indian families, this became a major life plan. But that model is now changing. You name the country now: Canada, Australia, the US, the UK. Across major study destinations, governments are under pressure to reduce the temporary migration, manage housing shortages, and control the number of international students. Well, Canada has tightened its immigration student system now. Australia has introduced stronger control and financial requirements. In the meantime, the United States has also seen heightened scrutiny and international students and immigration. The message is becoming clear. A foreign university admission is no longer automatically an immigration strategy. Students need to ask different questions. What are the post-study work rules? Does the degree qualify? What occupations are in demand? What are the tuition fee here? What is the cost of housing? How many hours can I legally work while studying? And yes, most importantly, what happens after graduation? Because a degree can still be valuable. But the assumption that the degree automatically leads to permanent residency, that is becoming increasingly risky. And this is specifically important for Indian families spending huge amount on overseas education. You cannot look only at the university ranking. You have to look at the entire immigration and employment ecosystem around that degree. And that takes us to another country where the rules are becoming stricter. Because the UK is now putting another number at the center of its immigration system: the salary number. For professionals considering the United Kingdom, one number matters a lot. Your salary. The UK has raised the general salary threshold for many skilled worker applicants, with the precise threshold depending on the immigration route, occupation, and applicable as exemptions here. And yes, then comes another layer, the occupational going rate. In many cases, the workers have to meet the applicable salary requirement and the relevant going rate rules here. So, having a job offer that is not necessarily enough for you. The job needs to fit the immigration rule, the salary needs to fit, the occupation code needs to fit, and the employer needs to comply with the sponsorship requirement. In the meantime, for workers already in Britain, pay compliance, it can also become important for you. Your pay slips, your employment contracts, your certificate of sponsorship, your actual working arrangement. These documents need to tell the same story. And then there is a long-term question, settlement. The UK is also reviewing and changing different parts of its immigration system, by the way, including language and settlement requirement. So the old assumption here, I will get a job in Britain and eventually settle there. It is no longer something anyone should take for granted. It needs planning, it needs eligibility, and it needs constant monitoring of policy changes. But tonight's final story takes us back to Canada, because sometimes the most important immigration issue that is not getting into a country, it is being able to bring your family with you. For Indians living abroad, immigration is rarely just about one person. It is about parents, grandparents, children, siblings, families separated by thousands of kilometers. And that is why Canada's super visa, that remains an important route for parents and grandparents of Canadian citizens and permanent residents who want extended visas. But you know what? There is one thing families often forget. A visa is not the same as an immediate flight ticket. Processing time, it can change. They can vary by every single nation. Well, they can increase because of application volume and the processing time figure displayed by the immigration authority. It is an estimate, not a guaranteed deadline. So if your parents are planning to travel, do not build an expensive holiday around just an assumption processing date. Well, apply early, keep documents ready, check the financial requirement, and make sure the required medical and insurance condition, they are met. And you know what? Most importantly here, check the official processing information before making non-refundable travel plans. Because immigration is not just paperwork. Behind every single application is a family that is waiting. A child waiting for parent, a grandparent waiting to meet the grandchild, a family waiting to sit around the same dining table. And that is perhaps the biggest theme that is connecting everything that we have discussed tonight. Let's talk about the bigger picture in the end, ladies and gentlemen. So, what did these 13 stories tell us? They told us the global immigration and technology landscape is changing at the same time. Know the rule before the rules decide your future. This is Skyline, I'm Driti, Atri, and we will keep bringing you the stories behind the headlines, because the world is changing fast and you deserve to know where it is headed.